So glad you're here. As Garrett said, welcome. Just an honor to have you with us this morning, worshiping, learning together. And my name's Chris. We haven't met yet. And we started this conversation last week, this series of messages called Intentional Diversity. And I know for many of us, just to hear kind of that phrase, and we're going to talk about this at our church, really probably brings up this question: why? Why is this something we need to talk about? And why in this setting? And a few weeks ago, Garrett and I were having a conversation. We'd already decided a few months ago to have this series at this time. And Garrett started telling me this story, and a couple other people were there. And I go, Garrett, that's why we're doing this. That's why we're having this series. So instead of me trying to tell you his story, I said, why don't you just tell yourself? That's easier.
And so here I am.
So here's Garrett to tell his story.
I'm going to tell you my story. Maybe like 5 or so weeks ago, I was up here, preached a sermon that was about Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life, and I told a story. It was a story about the day my daughter was born, which was only a few weeks ago, like you said. And so, we went to the hospital, like you do when your wife is beginning the labor process. And we get in, we get checked into our room, we meet our nurse. Our nurse is astounding. She's incredible. She's the most sweet person. She's like really direct, but also very lighthearted and just very professional, but also so engaging. It's just the best. We hit it off right away. And as kind of the day goes on, we get to chatting, we really connect, and she asks a question. She says, so what do you guys do for a living? And it always causes me to pause because I never know what people are going to do when they find out that I'm a pastor. So I tell her, I say, well, I'm a pastor. And she immediately, I can just tell this has affected her in some way. Like her facial expression, her posture, I'm just like something about that answer did not sit well. And so she says, hey, can I ask you both a question? And I said, okay. And she said, I'm a lesbian, I have a wife, and I have a kid. Do you still want me to be your nurse? And so my wife and I looked at each other, and then we looked back at her, and we said, listen, you're an amazing nurse, and we would be honored to still have you as our nurse. And by the way, God loves you. And God is for you, and God is for your whole family. Now, we have to say that, and that's what I told you in that first sermon. It was all warm and fuzzy. What I didn't tell you was the next thing that happened. I saved that for this weekend. Because you see, what happened after that is we hit it off, and she immediately changes her posture. It's like, oh, kind of like, thank God, kind of a thing. And she starts asking us all these Bible questions. We start connecting, and we get to share with her. My wife and I get to share with her, like, how following Jesus has actually made our life better, and just get really practical about that and talk about like the difference Jesus has made for us. And she leaves the room and goes and does whatever nurses do when they leave a room, right? Because you got to remember, we're real casual. Like my wife's beginning labor. We're kind of like not prepared to have a Jesus moment. You know what I mean? And so she leaves the room, does her nurse thing, but turns out one of her coworkers kind of grabbed her real quick and said, oh, by the way, come here real quick. Hey, that young couple in that room that you're in, just so you know, they're Christians. Warning her. That guy, he's a pastor, just so you know. And what's great is since we'd already talked, the nurse looks at her and says, oh, I already know. We've talked about it and we're great friends, and walks away. So it's interesting. Here's what's interesting. She comes back to the room, tells us that this happened. And as you can imagine, it created even more interesting, intriguing conversation between us. And really, it was just such an interesting opportunity to have her come back into that and tell us that, because we didn't know what that meant. Someone warned her, and thank God we'd connected, but it's just that moment, and it really is the realization of like, why we need to have this conversation. I think it is. At least that's what you said it was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I'm always right.
You're always right.
Yeah.
I've learned that.
Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks for making me do this. It was great.
Don't clap for him. It just goes to his head. But as Garrett told us that story, we're sitting there a few weeks ago, and that second part, and this phrase I can't get out of my head. Why do we have to warn people when the Christians are coming? I mean, I'm trying not to be cynical, but and I don't begrudge this woman who made the warning. I actually know her. I know who she is, and she's just doing what probably a lot of us would have done. Hey, be careful. There's Christians over here. And here's the thing, it actually strikes me as quite problematic that that's really, in most cases, necessary to keep our friends from feeling judged and looked down upon. We have a reputation, and it's not because of any of the people in this room, right? Just like, I'm not talking about us. It's got to be people outside of this room. It can't be us. It's all the other Christians, right? There's this reputation that we're working against. And so when people say, why are we going to talk about intentional diversity, and why did you choose those words in these topics? It's because we live in a community where we warn people that Christians are coming. And I'm so grateful that the stereotype of a pastor at a church who'd be judgmental and uncomfortable with a nurse in a same-sex marriage was broken for just one person, maybe, because it was Garrett and his wife Lindsay. I mean, the perfect people to sit in that spot. And that stereotype doesn't exist because of any of us or because of Garrett, or hopefully not because of me, but it exists. It's a well-earned reputation that we have as followers of Jesus, that it's better to warn people than to celebrate our arrival. But here's what I believe, and this is why we're talking about this, is I am fully convinced that if enough of us, even just a few of us, decide to change direction, decide to love people who aren't like us, then I think we can change the reputation. I think we can overcome the stereotype. Not all over the world, maybe not on social media, not in our state or our country, but in this city, where we live, I think we have the ability to change it. I think that if enough of us decide to practice intentional diversity, and we would love people who aren't like us, we could change this entire community. Friends, you don't have to keep living. We don't have to keep living in the tension, the arguing, the pain that we experience. And some of us were experiencing at home, in our workplaces, where we're attending school, in our neighborhoods, at City Hall. We aren't doomed to this. We have the opportunity before us for Flagstaff, for Williams, for all the places that we call home, to be turned right side up. I believe we can change this, and I believe that we should. That's why we're talking about it. So how do we do this? And what does it mean? What does it mean to love someone who isn't like me? I think that phrase, to love somebody who isn't like you, is very subjective. So I want to help describe where we're coming from. What we're going to attempt to make really clear over the next few weeks. And I've really wrestled with this question of how to describe something very subjective, very contextualized, that every context, every situation requires really a different approach. And this phrase is really the best I think I can do, is love is the tension between acceptance and alteration. And here's what I mean by this is there are parts of people that need to be altered, that need to be changed. And to fully change people isn't always loving, but sometimes it is. And to fully accept someone feels loving, and many of us have been convinced that acceptance is the only path to love, and if you don't accept someone exactly how they are, then you're not loving them. But the truth of the matter is, and if you stop and think about it, it'll make a lot of sense, I think. Real love is in the middle. Because there are times where fully accepting someone and how they behave and their lifestyle choices actually isn't loving them. I mean, if your child is addicted to crack, you shouldn't say, I accept you. You dropped your crack pipe. Here you go. I mean, did you let your children play in traffic? What if they really wanted to? Did anybody do that? No, those people are not free. Right, you get that. But I really want to do this. I really want to play in traffic, Mommy. I don't like it when you tell me no. And you have to use these extreme examples to break over this mindset that full acceptance is the only way to love someone. It's not. Sometimes people are harming themselves. They're choosing things that aren't good. But to always try to change and fix everyone is not always the answer either. And the hard tension is really when someone is doing something they shouldn't, and painful and it's hard, and you still stand in that tension. You don't leave and abandon them. Love is the tension between acceptance and alteration. The reality is, when I was putting together these thoughts and this message, that going into this one piece of it was taking as much time as all the rest of it. And so in the interest of your lunch plans, a lot of this I want to talk more about. And Garrett's talked me into, we're going to record a conversation in a couple days and put it on our podcast just talking about this. Because it's so important, and I think it's countercultural to what we've been telling ourselves. Because some of us tell us everybody's got to change, everybody's got to look like us, everybody's got to do what we think is right. And some of us go, no, you just accept everyone exactly how they are, and love is in the middle. So we're going to put that together, we're going to talk about it more. And it might help you at some level. But for many of us, the real question we're going to dig in the rest of our time today is, do we really have to do this? The question is really whether we must love people who aren't like us. Is that for all of us, or is that because some of us just don't want to? We just don't feel like it. We don't think it's a real high priority. Let me show you someone else who didn't think it was either. In the book of Acts, the story of the Acts of the Apostles is the beginning of the church. Jesus' first followers and the things they did. And in Acts chapter 10, we have this account of God reminding Peter. His follower, we talked about a few weeks ago, Peter follows Jesus, unfollows Jesus, and the rest of his life wholeheartedly follows Jesus. But he wasn't always getting it right. And we have this story, check this out. In the very beginning of the chapter, it says in Caesarea, that's just the name of the city, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion. It was known as the Italian regiment. He's an officer in the Roman army. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. So this soldier, he follows God, he loves God. He's not Jewish, he's from some other place. And he has this vision, it tells us in the next few verses. This angel comes from God and talks to Cornelius, tells him to send people to go get a guy named Peter, who he doesn't know. He's never even heard of him. And he's a 2-day journey away. He sends these men to go get Peter. And as they're approaching Peter, the author tells us, as this story unfolds, is at a house that's overlooking the ocean, and he's up on the roof, and he has a vision. Very similar situation happens to him. And in this vision, God uses food to teach Peter a lesson. And really the lesson is that only God gets to decide what's clean and what's unclean. And in Peter's system and his religion, the way he was doing it, he still followed all of the Jewish dietary food restrictions because that's what he thought he needed to do. And he sees this vision 3 times. Here's the voice of God 3 times. The 3rd time, as he's having this vision, the men from Cornelius' house show up and ask for Peter. Peter has no idea what God is doing. He just has had this vision. It's very vague what it means. And these men from a Roman army commander have come to get him, to take him to see their boss. So he travels with them. He arrives at Cornelius' house, and then he says this. This is his opening greeting as he walks in the house, full of people waiting to hear what the man of God has to say. He says, "You are well aware that it's against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean." Now, I know you read the Bible with like with a view of politeness and everything's nice. But let me help you understand. Peter's being a knucklehead. Go into your friend's house or some people's house next time you're there and go, "Hey, people like me don't normally associate with people like you. But my dad told me I had to." I mean, if you have a teenager, can you hear the eye roll in this statement? Like, it's just words on a piece of paper. We don't see the emotion of it. But I'm going to show you how I know this. Peter doesn't want to do this. He walks in and insults the guy who's a commander of an occupying army. I mean, he's bold, but he's rude. "I don't want to say I'm sorry, but Mom said I had to tell you I'm sorry." I mean, that's what he's doing. He's acting like a child. And then Cornelius tells him, You can read it. It's right there, next few verses. Cornelius says to Peter, here's all the things I know. This is what God's been doing and saying. And then Peter says this, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. Not when I got here, not when God told me 3 times 2 days ago. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, because he thought God did, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. So here's Peter, who followed Jesus every day for 3 years, saying, I didn't get it. I thought God picked favorites. And so if you're here today, or even the next few weeks in this series, and you have your moment where you go, oh, I now realize God doesn't show favorites. It's okay that you haven't gotten it before now. Peter didn't get it for years, but here he gets it because he came from a system. He'd been taught his whole life that God could truly only interact with one ethnic group of people. And even when Jesus would try to explain it was going to change, it was becoming different, Peter just didn't get it. And God had to remind Peter that his kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus, is no longer an ethnic, earthly kingdom, but rather the place that we all get to practice intentional diversity. So then Peter continues, he talks next and he says, let me tell you the events of what happened in Jerusalem just this past Easter. Well, he didn't use that word because they didn't use that word yet, but he tells the story of Easter to Cornelius and to these people. They didn't know what had happened. And he says, I saw it as an eyewitness to the love of the cross, the power of the resurrection. And then verse 44, while Peter was still speaking these words, the Holy Spirit came on all who had heard the message. The circumcised believers who'd come with Peter were astonished. So these other Jewish followers of Jesus who were still following all of the old ways, they were astonished that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on Gentiles, because they thought it was only for the Jews, even as they started to follow Jesus. Have you ever met someone who started following Jesus and it just simply astonished you? It was this demonstration of intentional diversity that allowed every single person in this room who isn't of Jewish descent to become a follower of Jesus. Until this point, everyone who's following Jesus is Jewish first, or had to become a follower of the Jewish religion, then could follow Jesus. We are called to demonstrate the same love that Jesus demonstrated when he died on a cross for us. We're called to demonstrate the same power that Jesus demonstrated when he rose from the dead, when he resurrected. Not just to those people who are, it's easy, but to everyone around us, people who aren't like us. So how do we do that? What are just some simple things that we can do to show love? Because it's got to be more than a mental exercise. It can't just be a convincing ourselves. I think it's going to take some action. So I have 3 ideas, 3 suggestions of things you could do and things I can do. The first is to listen. And this seems really basic, but this is really hard. Some of the best advice anyone's ever given me was when they pulled me aside and said, Chris, you got to change your approach. So you keep trying to be understood. You need to understand. And I did. I needed to listen because I kept trying to make my point and win arguments and be convincing instead of listening to the other people. Could we, at some moment this week, just listen to someone? Have you ever noticed that when you try to debate and argue with people, you don't win? Even if you win? I mean, just try that at home. That's where you learn this lesson. Right, friends? It's true everywhere, especially with people who aren't like us. No one has changed their mind through an argument. It doesn't work that way. When you listen and you can really understand someone, you're simply just showing them you care. And for many of us, I think there's going to be some real challenges to this. because I see more and more of the people around me, the people I interact with, is that we just can't listen. We've been convinced that there's nothing worth listening to. I think for many of us, the only way we're going to be able to listen is if we turn off the news. And I think specifically the news. And you can disagree with this. My opinion, it's not in the Bible, but you're going to be wrong. I mean, you don't have to do it, but you're not going to be able to listen. Because here's what I'm seeing over and over again in the conversations I have with people, the people I interact with are those of us among us who listen to the news too much. In either direction of the whatever channel or whatever flavor of news you want, what both sides are saying, you understand they're saying the exact same thing, right? The other side's out to get you. They're going to take away your thought, your freedom, that what you have, they want. And on both extremes, we're hearing the same message of fear, of anger. And some of us, if we're honest, we're just addicted to the news, to the commentary. And it's because these divisive companies are entertainment companies. They're trying to make money off you watching their ads. And they really don't care what happens. And so I don't care if it's Fox or CNN or MSNBC. Some of us just need to turn it off because you're not listening. You're afraid. And that fear is keeping you from listening to people who aren't like you. You've lost your objectivity, and it's not coming from Jesus. So maybe just turn off the news for a week. See what happens. Last night, I shared this exact same thing, and I've had this conversation many, many times with people individually. And last night, a lady left and said, I quit watching the news 3 months ago, and my anxiety and stress has gone down. She goes, I feel like myself again. I was like, can you write that out? Like, people don't believe me. I've had that conversation a dozen times. Friends, some of us are losing our soul. Just try it. Listen to a real person, someone you interact with, someone you know. And just have a conversation with them. Ask them their story. And then after you listen, here's what I think we do next is you just have to look for what we have in common. You look for what you have in common with the people around you. Whether you feel like they're really different or really similar, there's so many things we have in common. We have much more in common with other people than we have different. Ask people questions. It's really simple to just go up to someone and go, hey, tell me your story. Because guess what? That's their favorite topic. And guess what your favorite topic is? You. We love to talk about ourselves. Just ask people to talk about themselves and see what you learn and find out what you have in common. Next time you're sitting somewhere in a restaurant or a waiting room or a lobby, you find yourself near somebody, an international student maybe, somebody who's different from you, just ask them, what do you miss about home? What do you like about studying here? Look for what you have in common. I start to imagine now as my kids are getting older, what would it be like if my son or one of my daughters goes and studies in some other place, some other country or culture? How would I want the people in that community to treat my kids there? Are we treating their kids, somebody else's son and daughter, in a similar fashion that we would want for our children? Because as parents, we have that in common. We want the same thing for our kids. No matter where you come from, who you are. What do you have in common with the people who are different from you? And here's the third thing that we can do to show love. We have to show it. Love is a demonstration. It's an action. It's not just changing our mind and saying, okay, now I love everybody. It's how do you demonstrate it? What are actions you could take? And I think oftentimes we think of these grand, big things, and love being demonstrated is often the simplest of things. This week, just look for ways to demonstrate love to someone who isn't like you. Maybe it's buying a cup of coffee, helping somebody with their yard work, or maybe a family or mom in your neighborhood watching their kids, or simple things. taking care of somebody's pet while they're out of town. I mean, what is it you could do to show love? I'd say the next time you're sitting at a restaurant somewhere and the waiter or waitress is the kind of person that scares you. You know this happens. It happens to me too. Your waitress comes over, your waiter, and you're like, wow, I didn't know you could pierce those things, or put tattoos there, and they're just different or whatever it is. And if you have tattoos or piercings, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying for some of us, it's shocking, and you're awesome, and I'm glad you have those, and it's nothing on your outside matters, right? God says that clearly. But for some of us, it still matters. And maybe you find yourself in that situation, you're with somebody just different than you, and they're serving you at a restaurant. Just give them the best tip you've ever given. And don't tell them, hey, I'm doing this because you're different than me. I mean, I don't know if I even have to say that, right? But for some of you, maybe. Look for ways to demonstrate love. It doesn't have to be big. It can be very simple. Something we're doing in about a week from Monday, is we're having this conversation. We have a guest speaker who's coming. It's a person I've started to interact with, and some of the things our church is doing internationally. And this conversation of how do you show love to Muslims in your community. And for us, the vast, vast majority of people who are Muslims in Northern Arizona are students at NAU from other countries and other places. And he's just going to share some of his history. He's worked in several Middle Eastern countries, written books on this topic. He's an incredible, incredible resource. He's just come to share with our church family. Anybody who wants to come and join this conversation, and I can't tell you his name or much of his specific information just for his own security, and we'd love to have you join us and just hear some proven and very simple ways that he's found or he's experienced all over the place and in other contexts similar to ours with students and just a conversation. And you have that information. You can find it on our app and our website, and we'd love to just have you join us. It's next Monday, because it's Jesus who said that people would know who his followers are by the way they showed love. He's the one that said that when people look at his church, they look at his followers in the generations to come, that they'd be able to pick them out by the ones who showed love. And if we would love people who aren't like us, this community would see it. They would know we were doing it because of who Jesus is in our life, that we're his followers. And I believe the opportunity before us is to truly change this community in quite miraculous ways. Could we become united? Could we become one? And in doing so, see the kingdom of Jesus more and more come into our lives and into our community. To stand in the tension between acceptance and alteration, and just humbly show love to everyone around us. We want to introduce this new song to you because it really just provides a way for you and I to express through these words, these lyrics, that we're bringing this effort to Jesus. I really see this time of this song being a time of prayer. I want to ask you to consider as you see the words and you hear the music, that this is our prayer. Jesus, make us one. Your will be done. We don't always get things right. We make mistakes, but Jesus, because you want us to be one in your family and you want us to treat the people outside of these walls well, to show them love, help us. This is hard. I know it's difficult. It's hard for me. It's hard for all of us. But it's possible because of the sacrifice of Jesus. He's the one who does this work. So Jesus, help us love people who aren't like us. Jesus, make us one.